My name is Anne Butler, and my primary role here is Aboriginal Affairs Officer. A Wampum Belt goes back to pre-contact period, mostly along the east coast of North America, where a certain type of clamshell was used to create small beads. Two different types of shells. That would create two colors of beads. So you have like this purple indigo kind of swirly bead, and then a white, beige, pinkish bead. And belts would be woven with designs in them that would be pictorial depictions of, could be histories, could be community events. It could be depicting a treaty between two groups or between more than two groups. But also the wampum beads were used on strings to sometimes indicate adoption or other types of agreements that people had made. So they're sort of a cross between a written and an oral history. But with the wampum belt, although you have this pictorial depiction of whatever it is you're trying to say, whether it's a treaty or history or proceedings of council meetings, you still need the oral part. So in most communities, there would be one person designated who would be the person that would give that oral history. And in the Mi'kmaq community, that person is a Budus. And that person then carries those stories. So if you have a wampum belt with a particular story on it, that Budus is the one who carries that story. So you can't just look at the wampum belt and know exactly what it means. You might be able to pick out what different symbols are, but you don't actually know the whole story till you hear the oral telling of it. So that's basically what a wampum belt is. And when Europeans arrived in the Americas, these were used to make treaties between indigenous groups and Europeans. And this project, the Grenfell campus wampum belt project, when I started in this role 3 years ago, I was trying to come up with something that could tie people together. So take people from the community and people on the campus, whether they be students, staff, faculty, and connect them somehow, but also be participating together collaboratively in some sort of activity that's also educational. So I thought if we took this wampum belt concept and then we created our own wampum belt, that this would be something that a bunch of people, all different types of people, might buy into, participate in, and be interested in the outcome. So the wampum belt started out with ideas for what's going to be on the wampum belt. And with the Indigenous Student Caucus here on campus, we came up with what the big symbols would be for the Indigenous groups in the province. So in this province, we have Mi'kmaq people, we have Inuit, we have Southern Inuit, and we have Innu. So we took the Inukshuk symbol to represent both the Inuit on the north coast of Labrador and the Southern Inuit on the south coast. Then we have the Mi'kmaq symbol for Ulnu, which is the Mi'kmaq symbol for human being or humans. And then for the Innu, we have a large snowshoe to represent the Innu people. And that was all decided by the Indigenous students in the Indigenous Caucus. So they anchor the belt so that the theme of the belt is that we're all connected. So one end of the belt has the Inukshuk, then in the center has the Mi'kmaq symbol. And the reason the Mi'kmaq is in the center is because Grenfell campus is actually in Mi'kmaq territory. And then the other end of the belt we're almost finished with it, we'll have the large snowshoe for the Innu. But all of the designs in between, which are smaller, those were all done by putting a call out pretty much across the province, using social media, using messaging services through the campus and word of mouth, that we were looking for designs based on this particular theme. And the only requirement was that if you submitted a design, you had to also submit a story that goes with it. So what's the story behind the design? What most people submitted is something of their own story or their own community's story. And then we gave them kind of grids that look like graph paper and told them it has to be just two colors. So they kind of colored in, and if there was some mix up or it didn't fit, then I would jig it so that it would fit into the template. I would send it back to them and ask them if it was acceptable, if like the circle was shifted a bit or whatnot, so that it was still their design. And we're almost finished weaving it. So this has been 2.5 years since we a little over 2 years since we started weaving it. The first process was getting all these designs. So the weaving then also involves as many people as possible. So I have carried this wampum belt all over the province. I have not got to the north coast of Labrador, unfortunately, but I have been in Labrador, been up the northern peninsula of the island, up and down the west coast. I've been to St. John's with it, and in a couple of weeks I'm taking it down to Conn River and to Burgeo as the final 2 stops. So I've had like a 4-year-old in Sheshi wove on this belt. We've had women in their 80s weaving on it. I've taken it to different clubs and organizations when they're having their meetings, just to get as many people as possible. And I think we have over 100 people that have actually woven on the belt. And then 20 designs that were submitted by various groups. And then the 3 main symbols. So once the weaving is completely finished, then we're having a gathering where all of these stories will be told. And they all do connect to one another. So for example, one of the symbols on the belt is caribou antlers, and that isn't limited to the group that submitted that design. So it was an Innu person who submitted the design, but that the caribou is the Mi'kmaq, the Inuit, and the Innu all relate to the caribou. So the stories are all connected, and once it's done, we have the gathering, everyone tells their stories, and then it will be displayed hopefully in the main atrium in the Arts and Science building. And we have plans for getting a website going where you'd be able to click on a symbol and then you can listen to the person telling the story. So when everyone tells the stories, we're going to be recording everything. That is a long-term kind of project, but hopefully that will happen quickly after we get the belt finished. I think the idea came to me, first of all, I'm a historian, so I've always been interested in wampum belts, but over the past 5 years, I think it was in 2013 when one of the main belts that I think was the 2-row wampum belt was repatriated. I could have the year wrong, but it was in recent years, and there became like a renewed interest in wampum belts, and universities especially now have been kind of adapting what they call like wampum principles and whatnot. And I thought these are great ideas. And there's one of the Aboriginal student centers at, I forget which university, somewhere out west, that has the whole side of the wall looks like a 2-row wampum belt, but the colors are shaded. They're actually images of people's faces done in a kind of in a monochromatic purpley indigo that makes it look like the belt. I liked that, but I thought like I actually want to actually do the process of making the belt. Like that's part of what is the community building aspect of the wampum belts. Historically, you'd have different people with different roles. Somebody was creating the bow that would make the loom. Somebody's collecting the shells. Somebody's whittling them down. Somebody's making the implements that they use to bore out the holes in the beads. Somebody's coming up with the design, and I thought we can't replicate it exactly, but we can try to do that now. Instead of just talking about wampum ideas and wampum principles, actually make a wampum belt. And I think it's been positive, but that was where my inspiration came, was just sort of this resurgence of interest in wampum belts across Canada and also in the northern part of the United States. The goal for me was coming into this role, it was my first initiative, and I knew I wanted it to be a long-term goal. I do not like to see things that are done as like check off a box kind of thing, or really speedily trying to get something going. For me, it's meaningful if people are invested in it and they're participants in it. And so the goal for me is that when the belt is finished, that people want to look at it and remember where it was that they were weaving when they, because when I brought it someplace twice, like maybe several months later, I brought it back and someone says, I was the one that did this row over here. I want them to be invested in that and then to talk about it. And hopefully, too, it might end up being helpful with K-12 curriculum in this province if we have this really great website created with the histories of all the groups, the indigenous groups in the province. I think it was always trying to get the community involved with the campus, but I think I've been pleasantly surprised with just how many people were interested. So once I started going to a couple of different places, then people started contacting me and wanting me to come. So I went to the Beothuk Interpretation Center one weekend and stayed there and had busloads of like these Americans from New York and Vermont and stuff getting off the bus and coming in and asking about it. And those were not people I had intended to encounter, but I thought it was pretty cool. Excuse me. I also did another interpretation center up at Port au Choix, where the same kind of thing, people that are coming in to look at the exhibit were then drawn over to the belt. And that was not my target group. So the target group was the surrounding indigenous communities, but also the non-indigenous parts of the community, to have some sort of education around indigenous history in the province. I think it's an example of positive indigenous education, I'll say it that way. I think because I've been so pleasantly surprised with the response that I've had from community members, and then people, each person taking away something from the experience. So there's one part of the belt where, this part here, I was in Shashi at the youth center, and these little tiny girls, 4 or 5 years old, were actually weaving on it, and they weren't even shy. That was the thing too. Like when I went to the women's groups, they were so scared they might prick themselves, or they were gonna, or they're gonna break the bead. But the little kids just, I had these big long doll needles, and they just took right at it. These 2 little girls were weaving right here, and I started telling them about the man that gave me the design for the piece that they were weaving, which is one of my Mi'kmaq elders, Calvin White. And so I started telling them about Calvin, and then when they were finished and I was leaving and I was packing up, and they said, "You tell Mr. Calvin that we were the ones that wove on his part." So I think that's part of, for me, what's excellent about it is the connections that people are making. Even though they don't actually know each other, they know that they are working with other people on the same project. Indigenous education, well, it needs to look different from education now. The structure needs to be completely overhauled from kindergarten all the way through post-secondary. And I think that in order for that to happen, there has to be a shift in the way people think about education. But this project, the Wampum Belt project, is an example of what someone might refer to as non-traditional education, but is actually a form of indigenous education, right? So people are learning through practical application of something that is a tradition it's certainly not a universal indigenous tradition, but in some First Nations, it is a tradition that existed prior to European contact. And I think that physical participation is an example of indigenous education. So we're doing it by actually doing the action and not just talking about it. But yeah, I think indigenous education is really a stripping down of the whole colonial structure that has created the systems that we have in place now, and then rebuilding it using indigenous ways of being and knowing. We need to have indigenous people leading more. I think it's happening very, very sporadically now, only in certain areas. Indigenous people need to be included in all levels of educational governance. So whether that is in the K-12 system, whether that's in post-secondary, in the college system, university system, Indigenous people need to be in all levels of governance, so that when all these decisions are being made about what happens in those institutions, Indigenous people are at the table having those conversations and can add the lens of indigeneity to the discussion. But I think that in order for that to happen, and I've said this already, there has to be a mind shift in the existing leadership, because we're kind of, it's an uphill battle right now. But I think that unless Indigenous people are in those leadership roles, the concept of what is Indigenous education is going to be continually misunderstood. And so we're never going to get to shifting toward Indigenous education until we have that. So I think slowly that's happening. It's just going to take a while. Money is the big one. But money doesn't, and I said this before, money doesn't do anything if you don't have the right people involved. So I think that tapping into traditional community members, I think that there's a reaction in institutions that when they want to get some sort of Indigenous input, they go talk to the chief, they go to the office. That's not where you're going to get, and I don't mean anything against the chiefs, but that's not an Indigenous way of doing something, right? So you need to go to the elders and you need to go to the women in the community and talk to them. And I think that that's one of the resources that it isn't about getting the resource. The resource is there. It's about understanding the value of that resource and then trying to tap into it. So I think institutions know, maybe they don't know, but those resources are there. They're just not tapping into them because they don't hold, and I don't mean any individuals specifically, but institutions don't hold those resources at the same value as others, and that's where the shift needs to change.